The frozen wind cut through the Montana wilderness like a blade, and Mike Cross could barely see 10 feet ahead through the swirling snow. His truck had died 3 miles back, leaving him and Shadow to navigate the blizzard on foot. This wasn't how he'd planned to spend his Saturday, but then again, nothing in Mike's life had gone according to plan for years. The former police officer pulled his collar tighter against the storm, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Shadow walked close beside him, the German shepherd's white-gray coat blending almost perfectly with the snow-covered landscape. Mike had been driving back from town when the storm hit harder than the weather service predicted. Within minutes, visibility dropped to near zero, and his old pickup started sputtering. He'd tried to restart it 3 times before accepting the inevitable. The nearest shelter was his cabin, roughly 5 miles through the forest. He knew these woods well enough to navigate them blind, but this blizzard was something else entirely. Shadow suddenly stopped, his ears perking up despite the howling wind. The dog's amber eyes fixed on something off the trail, his body tensing in that particular way that meant he'd detected something important. Mike had learned to trust Shadow's instincts without question. During their years together, first in the K-9 unit and now in retirement, the dog had saved his life more times than he could count. "What is it, boy?" Mike muttered, squinting in the direction Shadow was staring. Through the curtain of snow, he could barely make out a dark shape about 30 yards into the trees. It wasn't moving, but Shadow's intense focus told him it wasn't just a fallen log or snow-covered boulder. The dog took a few steps forward, then looked back at Mike, clearly wanting him to follow. Against his better judgment, Mike left the trail and pushed through the deep snow toward whatever Shadow had found. Each step was a battle against the wind and the knee-deep powder. His legs burned with effort, and ice crystals stung his exposed skin. But Shadow was insistent, staying just ahead of him, repeatedly looking back to make sure Mike was following. As they got closer, Mike's heart sank. The dark shape resolved into something he'd hoped never to encounter in conditions like these. It was a wolf, a large female, lying on her side in the snow. Her gray and white fur was matted with ice, and her breathing was shallow and labored. But what made Mike's blood run cold wasn't the wolf herself. It was the 3 small shapes huddled against her body. Cubs. Probably no more than a few weeks old, their eyes barely open. Shivering violently in the deadly cold, the mother wolf's eyes found Mike's, and in them he saw something that transcended species. It wasn't aggression or fear. It was desperation. A mother's plea for her children. She tried to lift her head, but couldn't manage more than a few inches. Mike could see now that her left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, likely broken. She must have fallen, possibly from the rocky outcropping visible through the trees above. In this weather, with that injury, she and her cubs had maybe an hour left. Probably less. Mike stood frozen, his mind racing through options. Every wilderness survival instinct he had screamed at him to walk away. Wolves were dangerous, especially injured ones protecting their young. He was already in a life-threatening situation himself, still miles from shelter in a worsening blizzard. Stopping to help would put both him and Shadow at serious risk. The smart move, the logical move, was to continue toward the cabin and report the wolves' location to wildlife services once the storm passed. If they survived that long, but Mike Cross had stopped listening to the smart, logical voice in his head years ago. That voice had told him to look the other way when his fellow officers bent the rules. It had told him to keep quiet when he witnessed injustices that didn't fit neatly into the system he'd sworn to uphold. Following that voice had nearly destroyed him, had left him so disillusioned with law enforcement that he'd walked away from 20 years of service. Now, staring into the dying wolf's eyes, he made a decision that defied all logic. "We're not leaving them," Mike said quietly to Shadow. The dog sat in the snow, his intelligent eyes moving from Mike to the wolves and back, as if confirming he understood. Mike slowly approached the mother wolf, keeping his movements calm and predictable. She watched him intently, but didn't try to move. She was too weak, and somewhere in her fading consciousness, she seemed to understand he wasn't a threat. Not yet. Anyway, Mike knelt in the snow about 6 feet from the wolves, ignoring the cold seeping through his jeans. He needed to assess the situation carefully. The mother's breathing was becoming more labored, and her eyes were starting to lose focus. Hypothermia was setting in fast. The 3 cubs were in even worse shape, their tiny bodies shaking uncontrollably against their mother's failing warmth. Mike had maybe 15 minutes to make a decision that would determine whether any of them survived the night. He looked at Shadow, who remained calm and alert, showing no aggression toward the wolves. That was a good sign. If Shadow sensed immediate danger, he'd have warned Mike by now, all right. Think this through, Mike muttered to himself, his years of emergency response training kicking in, despite the surreal situation. The mother wolf couldn't walk, that much was clear. The cubs couldn't survive without their mother's warmth, and none of them could survive much longer in this blizzard. Mike had a choice to make, and he had to make it fast. His own survival depended on reaching shelter soon, but leaving these animals to die wasn't something he could live with. He'd already compromised too many of his principles during his police career. He wasn't going to add this to the list. Mike slowly removed his heavy winter coat, immediately feeling the full force of the freezing wind through his flannel shirt. He spread the coat open and moved carefully toward the cubs. The mother wolf's eyes followed his every movement, a low growl rumbling in her chest, but she didn't have the strength to act on the warning. Mike spoke in a soft, steady voice as he approached, more to calm himself than the animal. "I'm trying to help. I know you don't understand that, but I'm trying to help your babies." The cubs made small whimpering sounds as Mike gently scooped them into his coat. They were so small, probably only 3 or 4 weeks old. Their eyes were barely open, and their fur was still the fluffy, grayish color of young wolf pups. He wrapped them carefully in the thick fabric, creating a makeshift pouch against his chest. The mother wolf's growl intensified, her maternal instinct overriding her weakness, but she couldn't do anything to stop him. With the cubs secured against his body, Mike turned his attention to the mother. This was going to be the hard part. The wolf probably weighed close to 90 pounds, and with a broken leg, moving her would be agonizing for the animal and dangerous for Mike. But leaving her here meant certain death, and the cubs wouldn't survive long without her, even if Mike managed to keep them warm temporarily. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast, because his core temperature was already dropping without his coat. "Shadow." Mike called to his dog, who immediately moved closer. The German shepherd positioned himself between Mike and the direction of the cabin, as if he understood they needed to create a path. Mike removed his belt and fashioned it into a makeshift muzzle, approaching the wolf slowly. She was too weak to resist much, but the moment he touched her injured leg, her jaws snapped weakly in his direction. The belt was necessary, not just for his safety, but to prevent her from biting through her own tongue in pain during the move. "I'm sorry. I know this is going to hurt," Mike said, his hands working quickly to secure the muzzle. The wolf's eyes held his, and for a moment, he could have sworn he saw understanding there. Or maybe it was just exhaustion. Either way, she stopped fighting and let her head fall back into the snow. Mike took a deep breath, positioned himself, and lifted the wolf as carefully as he could. She wasn't as heavy as he'd feared, likely weakened by injury and the cold, but it was still a significant weight to carry through deep snow. The journey back to the trail was brutal. Mike's arms screamed with effort, the cubs squirmed against his chest, and every few steps the mother wolf would tense and whimper as pain shot through her broken leg. Shadow led the way, his powerful body breaking a path through the snow. The wind seemed to grow even stronger, as if nature itself was testing Mike's resolve. His exposed arms quickly went numb, and he could feel ice forming in his short gray beard. But he kept moving, one painful step at a time. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second to avoid dropping the wolf or crushing the cubs against his chest. His muscles burned, his lungs ached from breathing the frozen air, and his thoughts started to blur at the edges. The first warning sign of hypothermia. He recognized it from his emergency response training, but there was nothing he could do except keep moving. Stopping meant death. For all of them, Shadow stayed close, occasionally looking back to make sure Mike was still behind him. The dog's presence was the only thing keeping Mike oriented. Without Shadow's instincts, he would have been hopelessly lost in the whiteout conditions. The cabin couldn't be more than 2 miles away now, but in this weather, 2 miles might as well be 20. Time lost all meaning. There was only the next step, and the next breath, and the fragile lives depending on him not giving up, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Shadow's behavior changed. The dog's pace quickened, and his tail lifted slightly. A sign of recognition. They were close. Mike forced his frozen legs to move faster, though every muscle in his body protested. The cubs had gone quiet against his chest, their small bodies warm but still. Too still. He couldn't tell if they were sleeping or slipping into hypothermia. The mother wolf had also gone quiet, her breathing shallow but steady. Mike's own consciousness was starting to fade at the edges, the dangerous warmth of severe hypothermia beginning to creep in. Through the curtain of snow, a dark shape emerged. The cabin. Mike had never been so relieved to see anything in his life. Shadow reached the door first, scratching at it, as if he could open it himself. Mike stumbled up the 2 steps to the porch, nearly dropping his burden. His hands were so numb he could barely feel his fingers as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket. It took 3 tries to get the key in the lock, and when the door finally swung open, he practically fell inside. The cabin was cold, but it was shelter from the wind. Mike carefully lowered the mother wolf onto the floor near the fireplace, then unwrapped the cubs from his coat. All 3 were alive. He could see their small chests rising and falling, but they needed warmth immediately. Shadow was already at the fireplace, and Mike realized with dim amusement that his dog knew exactly what needed to happen next. He'd started keeping the kindling and firewood ready after moving to Montana, a habit from his years of emergency preparedness training. Mike's hands shook violently as he built the fire, barely able to grip the matches. It took 4 tries to light one, and another 2 minutes to get the kindling burning. But once the flames caught, they spread quickly through the dry wood. Heat began to radiate into the small space, and Mike positioned the cubs close to the fireplace, but not too close. The mother wolf lay where he'd placed her, her eyes half closed, her breathing still shallow. He carefully removed the makeshift muzzle, and she didn't react. That worried him more than if she'd tried to bite. Shadow took up a position near the wolves, not threatening, just watchful. Mike grabbed blankets from the bedroom, draping them over the mother wolf, and creating a nest for the cubs. Only then did he allow himself to attend to his own hypothermia. He stripped off his wet clothes, his fingers barely functioning, and wrapped himself in a dry blanket near the fire. His body shook uncontrollably as his core temperature slowly began to rise. The pain of warming up was almost worse than the cold had been, a burning sensation in his extremities that made him grit his teeth. As feeling returned to his hands and feet, Mike assessed his patience. The cubs were warming up, their shivering becoming less violent. They had snuggled together in the blanket nest, occasionally making small sounds. The mother wolf was the biggest concern. Her broken leg needed to be immobilized, and she was likely suffering from internal injuries from the fall. Mike had basic first aid training, but he'd never treated a wolf before. He knew the fundamentals would be the same. Stabilize the patient, keep them warm, address immediate threats to life. Using strips torn from an old shirt and 2 sturdy pieces of firewood, Mike fashioned a splint for the wolf's leg. She was too weak to resist, though he could see the pain in her eyes as he worked. He was as gentle as possible, speaking in soft tones the entire time, though he knew she couldn't understand his words. When the splint was secured, he covered her with another blanket and left a bowl of water within reach of her muzzle. She didn't drink, but at least it was available when she was ready. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Mike added more wood to the fire and checked on everyone again. The cubs were definitely stronger now, moving around more in their blanket nest, their eyes trying to focus on their surroundings. Shadow lay near them, his presence seeming to calm them. Or maybe they were too young to understand that the massive German Shepherd could be dangerous. Either way, it was working. Mike's satellite phone was on the kitchen counter, but when he tried to use it, he got no signal. The storm was too severe, blocking any connection. He was on his own until the weather cleared, which according to the last forecast he'd heard, could be anywhere from 12 hours to 3 days. He had enough food for himself and Shadow, but nothing appropriate for wolves. The mother would need nourishment to heal, and the cubs would need their mother's milk to survive. The first night was the longest of Mike's life. He dozed fitfully in his chair near the fire, waking every hour to check on the wolves and add wood to keep the temperature stable. The cubs slept curled together, occasionally making soft whimpering sounds. The mother wolf remained motionless except for her breathing, which at least seemed to be growing stronger. Shadow rotated between positions, sometimes near Mike, sometimes near the wolves, always alert by dawn. The storm had not let up. Mike could barely see the tree line through the window, the snow falling so thick it created a solid white wall. He made coffee and ate a cold breakfast, not wanting to create food smells that might agitate the wolves. The cubs were definitely more active now, trying to crawl around their blanket nest, their eyes opening more fully. They were beautiful, with the distinctive facial markings and oversized paws that promised they would grow into large, powerful animals. The mother wolf had finally drunk some water, which Mike took as a positive sign. She was watching him now with more alertness, her amber eyes tracking his movements around the cabin. There was still wariness there, but the desperate fear from the night before had faded. Mike maintained his distance, giving her space while staying close enough to intervene if needed. He had no illusions about the danger. This was a wild animal, injured and protective of her young. One wrong move, and she could still cause serious harm, broken leg or not. By the second day, the storm finally began to ease. The wind died down, and the snow fell less heavily, though it still showed no signs of stopping completely. Mike managed to get a brief signal on his satellite phone and sent a message to the Montana Wildlife Services. He explained the situation and requested guidance. The response came back an hour later. They advised him to keep the wolves stable and warm, and said they'd send a team as soon as the roads were passable. Likely in another day or two, the cubs were thriving in the warmth of the cabin. They had discovered Shadow and seemed fascinated by the large dog. Shadow, to his credit, tolerated their clumsy attempts at play with remarkable patience. He would lie still while they climbed over him, their tiny paws slipping on his thick coat. The mother wolf watched these interactions intently, and Mike could see the conflict in her eyes. Her instincts told her that the dog was dangerous, but Shadow's gentle behavior was slowly earning her trust. Mike started offering the mother wolf small pieces of raw meat from his freezer. At first, she refused, but hunger eventually won out. She ate carefully, watching him the entire time. Mike always made sure to move slowly, to speak in calm tones, to respect her space. He was no expert in animal behavior, but his years as a police officer had taught him how to read body language and build trust in hostile situations. The principles weren't so different with a wolf. On the third day, something remarkable happened. One of the cubs, the smallest of the three, with a distinctive white patch over her left eye, managed to escape the blanket nest and waddle across the floor. She was heading straight for Mike, who was sitting near the fire, drinking his morning coffee. He froze, unsure what to do. The mother wolf tensed, a low growl building in her chest. But the cub was determined, her tiny legs carrying her forward with single-minded purpose. She reached Mike's feet and looked up at him with curious blue eyes that would eventually turn amber like her mother's. Then, without warning, she climbed onto his boot and curled up there, falling asleep almost instantly. Mike held his breath, expecting the mother to react aggressively. But instead, the growling stopped. The mother wolf laid her head back down, her eyes still on Mike, but no longer filled with warning. It was as if the cub's action had communicated something the mother understood. This human was safe. From that moment, everything changed. The mother wolf began to relax, her body language shifting from defensive to merely cautious. She allowed Mike to change the water bowl without growling. She ate the meat he offered without as much hesitation. And most surprisingly, she didn't object when Shadow moved closer to her cubs. It was as if she had made a decision to trust them, or at least to accept that she had no better option. The wildlife team arrived on the fourth day, as soon as the roads were clear enough to navigate. 2 rangers and a veterinarian made their way to Mike's cabin, bringing medical supplies and transport cages. Mike met them at the door, explaining everything that had happened. They were surprised to find the wolves not only alive, but showing signs of recovery. The vet examined the mother first, checking the splint Mike had made and assessing her overall condition. "You did good work here," the vet said, a woman in her mid-50s named Drive. Sarah Chen. "This splint probably saved her leg. And getting them out of that storm definitely saved their lives. The break is clean. We can set it properly, and she should heal fine. As for the cubs, they're in excellent shape, considering what they've been through. You must have kept them very warm." Mike nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. He knew the wolves couldn't stay. They were wild animals, and they belonged in the wilderness, not in a cabin with a disillusioned ex-cop and his retired K-9 partner. But over the past few days, something had formed between them. A connection he couldn't quite explain. Even now, the smallest cub, the one with the white patch over her eye, was asleep on his boot again. She'd made it a habit. The rangers prepared the transport cages, but Drive Chen hesitated. The mother wolf was watching Mike intently, and when the vet tried to approach with a sedative, the wolf's lip curled in warning. But when Mike stepped forward and placed his hand near her, speaking in those same calm tones he'd used for days, she relaxed. Dr. Chen administered the sedative without incident, and within minutes, the mother wolf's eyes grew heavy. Before she fully succumbed to sleep, her gaze found Mike's one last time. In that look, he saw something he'd recognize later in his nightmares and dreams. Gratitude. The rangers loaded the mother wolf and her cubs into the transport cages with professional efficiency. They explained to Mike that the family would be taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center about 60 miles away. The mother would receive proper medical treatment, and once she was healed and the cubs were old enough, they'd all be released back into the wild, in a protected area. It was the best outcome Mike could have hoped for, but watching them drive away left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. Shadow sensed his mood and pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. Mike reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, grateful for his loyal companion. They went back inside the cabin, which suddenly felt too quiet and too empty. Mike tried to return to his normal routine, but everything reminded him of the wolves. The blanket nest by the fireplace, the empty meat bowl, the small paw prints in the dust near the window where the cubs had played. Days turned into weeks, and Mike forced himself to move forward. He repaired some roof damage from the storm, chopped firewood for the coming months, and tried to ignore the nagging feeling that something was unfinished. Shadow seemed restless too, often sitting by the door as if waiting for something. Mike told himself they were both just adjusting back to normalcy. The wolf encounter had been an anomaly, a brief intersection of lives that were never meant to cross. It was over now, but life in the Montana wilderness has a way of defying expectations. 6 weeks after the wolves had been taken away, Mike was splitting firewood behind the cabin when Shadow suddenly went on alert. The dog's ears perked up, and he stared intently at the tree line about 50 yards away. Mike set down his axe and shaded his eyes against the afternoon sun. At first, he saw nothing. Then movement caught his attention. A wolf emerged from the trees, limping slightly but moving with purpose. Even from a distance, Mike recognized the gray and white pattern of her coat, the intelligent amber eyes. It was the mother wolf. She had found her way back to his cabin. Behind her, moving with the clumsy enthusiasm of young animals, came 3 cubs, significantly larger than when he'd last seen them, but still clearly juveniles. The smallest one, the female with the white patch over her left eye, bounded ahead of her siblings. Tail wagging, Mike stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The wildlife center was 60 miles away, over rough terrain. The mother wolf's leg was barely healed. There was no logical reason for them to be here, no instinct that would drive them to return to a human's cabin. Yet here they were, standing at the edge of the clearing, the mother wolf watching him with that same intense gaze. Shadow remained calm but alert, his body language showing curiosity rather than aggression. Mike slowly walked forward, stopping about 20 feet from the wolves. The mother wolf didn't retreat. Instead, she took several steps toward him, closing the distance to maybe 10 feet. Then she did something that made Mike's heart skip a beat. She lowered her head and placed something on the ground between them. A rabbit, freshly killed, still warm. Mike stared at the offering, his mind racing through everything he knew about wolf behavior. Wolves didn't bring gifts to humans. They avoided human contact whenever possible. This was unprecedented, inexplicable. The mother wolf backed away from the rabbit, then sat on her haunches, her cubs gathering around her. The smallest one, the female with the white patch, kept trying to come closer to Mike, but her mother gently grabbed her scruff and pulled her back. The message was clear, even across species. This was gratitude. The mother wolf was thanking Mike for saving her family. She had traveled 60 miles, navigating terrain and dangers Mike could only imagine, to bring him this offering. It defied everything he thought he knew about wild animals. It defied logic and reason. But it was happening, right in front of him. Mike carefully picked up the rabbit, nodding to the wolf in acknowledgement. The mother wolf's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag but close. Then she did something even more unexpected. She stood, turned toward the forest, and looked back at Mike over her shoulder. The cubs followed her lead, but they too looked back, their eyes bright with what Mike could only describe as trust. The smallest cub barked once, a high-pitched sound that echoed across the clearing. Then they were gone, melting back into the forest as silently as they'd come. Mike stood holding the rabbit, Shadow at his side, both of them staring at the empty tree line. The encounter had lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it had fundamentally changed something in Mike. For the first time since leaving the police force, since becoming so disillusioned with humanity and the systems meant to protect it, he felt a spark of something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope, purpose, connection. Over the following weeks, the wolves returned several more times. Always at dusk, always maintaining a respectful distance, and always leaving an offering. Sometimes it was a rabbit, once it was part of a deer haunch, another time it was several fish. The mother wolf never approached closer than that first time, but her presence became a regular part of Mike's life. Shadow seemed to accept them as part of the territory, no longer going on full alert when they appeared, just watching with calm interest. A smallest cub, the one with the white patch, was always the boldest. She would creep closer than her siblings, her tail wagging, clearly wanting to interact more directly. But her mother always called her back, maintaining the boundary between wild and domestic. Mike respected that boundary absolutely, never trying to approach them, never offering food, never doing anything that might encourage them to become dependent on humans. These were wild animals, and they needed to stay that way, but there was no denying the bond that had formed. Mike started referring to the mother wolf as Ghost, a name that seemed to fit her almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear silently. The smallest cub he called Patch, for obvious reasons. He didn't name the other two cubs, trying to maintain some emotional distance, but it was a losing battle. They had become part of his world in a way he never expected. Then came the night that changed everything again. Mike was asleep in his cabin when Shadow's urgent barking woke him. The dog was at the door, scratching frantically, his bark carrying an urgency Mike had learned to recognize. Something was wrong. Mike grabbed his coat and flashlight and followed Shadow outside into the cold night. The moon was full, casting the snow-covered landscape in silver light. Shadow took off running toward the tree line, and Mike followed as fast as he could. His heart pounded, adrenaline sharpening his senses. They'd gone maybe a quarter mile into the forest when Mike heard it. Wolves howling, but not the long, haunting calls of a pack communicating. These were shorter, more frantic. Distress calls. Shadow led him to a small clearing where he found Ghost and her 3 cubs surrounded by 4 larger wolves. A rival pack, likely challenging her for territory. Mike assessed the situation in seconds, his police training kicking in despite the surreal circumstances. Ghost was holding her ground in front of her cubs, but she was outnumbered and still recovering from her leg injury. The rival wolves were larger, well-fed, and aggressive. One of them, a massive male with scars across his muzzle, was clearly the leader. He was focused on Ghost, circling her, looking for an opening. The other 3 wolves were trying to get around her to the cubs. Shadow didn't hesitate. The German shepherd charged into the clearing with a ferocious bark that echoed through the trees. The rival wolves turned to face this new threat, momentarily confused. Shadow positioned himself between Ghost's cubs and the attacking wolves, his teeth bared, his body coiled and ready. Mike knew his dog was outweighed and outnumbered, but Shadow had never backed down from a fight in his life, and he wasn't starting now. Mike did the only thing he could think of. He fired his flashlight into the air and started shouting, making himself as large and loud as possible. The sudden noise and light startled the rival wolves, their attention splitting between Shadow, Mike, and Ghost. It was exactly the distraction Ghost needed. She lunged at the scarred male, catching him off guard, her teeth finding his shoulder. The male yelped and stumbled backward. Surprised by the injured wolf's ferocity, the other 3 wolves hesitated, their pack leader suddenly on the defensive. Shadow pressed his advantage, charging at the nearest wolf with such aggression that the animal turned and ran. Mike continued shouting and waving his flashlight, advancing into the clearing, despite every survival instinct screaming at him to run. He was betting everything on the wolves' natural fear of humans, hoping they'd choose retreat over a fight with an unknown threat. The scarred male recovered from Ghost's attack and snarled at her, but his confidence was shaken. He looked at Mike, then at Shadow, then back at Ghost. The calculation was clear in his eyes. This fight wasn't worth it. He barked once, a sharp command, and his pack retreated into the darkness. Within seconds, they were gone, leaving only the sound of their paws crunching through snow in the distance. Mike stood in the clearing, his heart racing, his breath coming in clouds. Ghost was panting heavily, blood on her muzzle from the attack, but she was standing. Her cubs were pressed against her, frightened but unharmed. Shadow moved to Mike's side, his body still tense, ready to fight again if needed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The forest was silent, except for the sound of breathing and the distant howl of the retreating pack. Then Ghost did something that would replay in Mike's mind for the rest of his life. She walked directly to him, closing the distance to less than 3 feet, and touched her nose to his hand. It was brief, just a moment of contact, but the meaning was unmistakable. She was thanking him again, not just for tonight, but for everything. For saving her family in the blizzard, for respecting their wildness, for coming to their aid when they needed help most. The smallest cub, Patch, broke away from her siblings and ran to Shadow. The young wolf and the retired K9 touched noses, and Mike could have sworn he saw something pass between them. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that they were, in some fundamental way, pack now. Brothers in arms, separated by species but united by loyalty and courage. Ghost called to her cubs with a soft bark, and they reluctantly left Shadow's side. She looked at Mike one last time, her amber eyes holding his blue ones, and in that gaze Mike saw everything he'd been searching for since leaving the police force. Purpose. Connection. Proof that doing the right thing, even when it defied logic and put you at risk, mattered. That one person, or one wolf, could make a difference. That honor and loyalty still existed in a world that often seemed devoid of both. Then Ghost and her cubs disappeared into the forest, and Mike and Shadow were alone in the moonlit clearing. Mike sank down onto a fallen log, his legs suddenly weak, the adrenaline crash hitting him hard. Shadow pressed against his side, and Mike wrapped an arm around his faithful companion. They sat there for a long time, neither moving, both processing what had just happened. The walk back to the cabin was quiet, Mike's mind replaying the events over and over. He checked Shadow carefully for injuries, but found none. The dog had been trained for situations far more dangerous than a wolf confrontation, and his instincts had been perfect. Mike, on the other hand, had multiple scratches from branches and a bruise forming on his shoulder where he'd collided with a tree in his rush to reach the clearing. Small prices to pay. Back inside the cabin, Mike made coffee despite the late hour, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. His hands shook slightly as he poured the steaming liquid, residual adrenaline still coursing through his system. Shadow lay by the fire, his eyes watchful but calm. Mike joined him on the floor, sitting with his back against the couch, the warmth of the flames slowly seeping into his cold muscles. "What the hell are we doing, Shadow?" Mike said quietly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We're supposed to be retired. Quiet life in the woods. No more danger. No more putting ourselves on the line." Shadow's only response was to lean more heavily against Mike's side. The message was clear. They were doing what they'd always done, what they were meant to do. Protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Regardless of the cost or the logic, Mike thought about his years on the police force, about all the times he'd turned away from injustice because fighting it would have cost him his career, about the corruption he'd witnessed and the compromises he'd made, about the day he'd finally walked away, so disgusted with himself and the system that he couldn't bear to wear the badge anymore. He'd come to Montana to escape all of that, to find peace in isolation. But peace, he was learning, wasn't about running away from the fight. It was about choosing your battles, about standing up for what mattered, even when nobody was watching. Especially when nobody was watching, the wolves had taught him that. A mother willing to die protecting her cubs. A pack that traveled 60 miles to express gratitude. A family that returned to help when they could have stayed safely hidden in the forest. There was honor in that. Pure, uncomplicated honor that had nothing to do with politics or bureaucracy or legal technicalities. It was survival and loyalty and courage distilled to their most basic elements. Over the following months, the pattern continued. Ghost and her cubs would appear at the edge of the clearing every few weeks, maintaining their distance but making their presence known. They never came to beg for food or seek shelter. They were thriving in the wild, as they should be. But they maintained the connection, and Mike found himself looking forward to those visits more than he wanted to admit. They reminded him that his choice to help them hadn't been foolish. That sometimes the illogical choice was the right choice. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the Montana wilderness. The cubs, no longer cubs but adolescent wolves, had grown significantly. They moved with increasing confidence and skill, learning to hunt and survive under their mother's guidance. Patch remained the boldest, often venturing closest to the cabin, her distinctive white marking even more pronounced as she matured. But even she maintained the boundary her mother had established. Mike's life had found a new rhythm. He still questioned the world, still felt that underlying disillusionment with human systems and institutions. But the wolves had given him something to believe in again. Not blind faith or naive optimism, but proof that courage and loyalty and honor still existed, even if you had to look beyond humanity to find them. Shadow seemed more content too, as if having the wolves as extended pack members satisfied something in his working dog's soul that retirement had left empty. Then came the morning when Mike's past caught up with his present. He was checking his mailbox at the end of his long driveway when a black SUV pulled up. Two men in suits stepped out, and Mike immediately recognized the type, if not the individuals. Federal agents. His old world, finding him in his new one. The taller of the two, a man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner, showed his credentials. Agent Mark Reeves, FBI. The man said, "This is my partner, Agent Sarah Lynn. We need to talk to you about your time with the Denver Police Department. Specifically, about a case from 8 years ago." Mike's jaw tightened. He'd known this day might come eventually. When you walk away from the job because you witness corruption, people get nervous. They wonder what you know and who you might tell. "I'm retired," Mike said flatly. "Have been for 3 years. Whatever you're investigating, I'm not involved." Agent Reeves smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We know you're not involved. But we think you have information that could help us. A detective you worked with, Richard Morrison, has been arrested on corruption charges. Multiple counts. We believe you witnessed some of his activities before you left the department." Mike felt the old anger rising, the disgust with a system that had protected men like Morrison for years, while good cops who spoke up were forced out. "Why now?" Mike asked. "Morrison's been dirty for at least a decade. Everyone knew it. Why are you coming after him now?" Agent Lynn spoke for the first time, her voice calm and measured. "Because now we have enough evidence to make charges stick. And because his corruption led to 3 wrongful convictions that we're trying to overturn. Innocent people are in prison because of Morrison's lies. Your testimony could help free them." Mike looked back toward his cabin, visible through the trees. Inside, Shadow was probably napping by the fire, waiting for him to return. Beyond the cabin, somewhere in the forest, Ghost and her cubs were living their lives in the wild freedom they deserved. He'd walked away from all of this, from the politics and the ugliness of fighting a broken system. He'd found peace, or something close to it. These agents were asking him to give that up, to dive back into the world he'd escaped, but they were also asking him to do what he'd failed to do when it mattered most. To stand up for the innocent. To fight for justice, even when the system made it difficult. To be the kind of cop he'd wanted to be, before reality beat that idealism out of him. The irony wasn't lost on Mike. A wolf family had reminded him what honor looked like, and now he was being asked to show that same honor in his human life. The universe had a twisted sense of humor. "I'll testify," Mike said finally. "But I do it my way. I tell the truth. All of it. Even the parts that make the department look bad. No coaching. No sanitizing. Agent Reeves nodded. That's exactly what we need. Morrison's lawyers will try to discredit you, bring up your resignation, paint you as bitter and unreliable. But if you tell the truth, the evidence will support your testimony. When can you come to Denver? Mike thought about his calendar, the empty days stretching ahead. Soon. Give me a week to arrange things here. Shadow needs boarding, and I have some obligations to attend to. The agents left, and Mike walked slowly back to the cabin. Shadow met him at the door, immediately sensing Mike's troubled mood. Mike explained the situation out loud, knowing the dog couldn't understand the words, but finding comfort in the act of voicing his thoughts. He had a week to prepare for a trip he'd never wanted to make, back to a city he'd sworn never to return to. But if his testimony could free innocent people, how could he refuse? Ghost hadn't refused when her cubs needed her. Shadow hadn't hesitated when the rival pack attacked. Mike couldn't do any less that evening. As twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Ghost appeared at the edge of the clearing. She was alone, which was unusual. Her cubs typically traveled with her. She sat at her customary distance and watched the cabin. Mike grabbed his coat and walked outside, Shadow at his side. He stood on the porch, and Ghost remained at the tree line. For several minutes, neither moved. Just two beings acknowledging each other's presence. Then Ghost did something she'd never done before. She howled. Not the distress call from the night of the attack, but the long, haunting song of a wolf calling to its pack. The sound echoed across the valley, beautiful and mournful and fierce all at once. Shadow's ears perked up, and without any command from Mike, the dog tilted his head back and joined the howl. His voice, deeper and more canine than lupine, blended with Ghost's in an unlikely harmony. Mike stood transfixed, watching his retired canine partner sing with a wild wolf as the sun set over the Montana wilderness. He felt something shift inside him, a weight he'd been carrying for years, finally lifting. This was his pack now. Not just Shadow, but Ghost and her cubs too. And just as he'd fought for them, just as he'd risked everything to save them, he would fight for the innocent people Morrison had destroyed. Not because the system deserved his help, but because those prisoners deserved justice. Because doing the right thing wasn't about the system. It was about the choice each person made when faced with injustice. The week passed quickly. Mike made arrangements for Shadow to stay with a neighbor, a retired forest ranger named Tom, who understood working dogs. He packed a bag with his court clothes, suits he hadn't worn in years, that hung loosely on his frame now. He printed out old case files, reviewing details he'd tried to forget. And every evening, he sat on his porch and waited for Ghost to appear. She came twice more, always alone, always watching silently. On the last evening before his departure, she brought her cubs. Patch, now almost full-grown but still the smallest of the three, ventured closer than ever before. She came within 5 feet of the porch, her amber eyes, so like her mother's, studying Mike intently. Then she did something that made Mike's throat tighten. She bowed, the way wolves do when acknowledging pack hierarchy or showing respect. It was a gesture of trust and recognition that crossed all boundaries between species. Mike bowed back, feeling slightly ridiculous but deeply moved. Ghost barked once, sharp and commanding, and Patch retreated to her siblings. But before they disappeared into the forest, Ghost looked directly at Mike and then toward Shadow. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd spoken English. Take care of each other. Return safely. We'll be here. Then she was gone, melting into the shadows with her family, leaving Mike and Shadow alone with the approaching night. The trip to Denver was as difficult as Mike expected. The city felt too loud, too crowded, too full of the humanity he'd been avoiding. But his testimony was solid, unshakable. He told the truth about Morrison's corruption, about the evidence he'd seen tampered with, about the pressure put on officers to close cases regardless of actual guilt. Morrison's lawyers tried to break him, to paint him as a disgruntled former officer with an axe to grind. But Mike's calm demeanor and detailed recollections, supported by documents and other witnesses the FBI had gathered, held up under cross-examination. After 3 days of testimony, it was over. The judge thanked Mike for his service, and the prosecutors said his testimony had been crucial. Mike felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory. He'd simply done what should have been done 8 years ago. He'd stood up for the truth when it mattered. The innocent men would get new trials and likely be freed. Morrison would face justice. The system had worked, barely, finally. Mike wanted nothing more than to leave and never return. The flight back to Montana was delayed by weather, giving Mike too much time to think in the airport. He watched people rushing past, busy with their lives, blind to the corruption and injustice happening around them. Or maybe just exhausted by it, choosing ignorance as a survival mechanism. He couldn't judge them. He'd made that choice himself for years. But he couldn't make it anymore. Ghost had taught him that. Sometimes you had to fight, even when you were outnumbered. Even when victory wasn't guaranteed. Even when it would be easier to run. Shadow's greeting when Mike finally returned to Montana was enthusiastic enough to nearly knock him over. Tom laughed and said the dog had been pacing for 3 days, clearly missing his partner. Mike paid Tom and drove back to the cabin as fast as the mountain roads allowed. It was late afternoon when he pulled up to his home, the familiar sight of the cabin and the surrounding forest easing the tension he'd carried since leaving Denver. He unpacked quickly, eager to be outside, to shed the suit and tie and return to his flannel and jeans. Shadow was already at the door, whining softly. Mike followed him outside, and they walked toward the tree line. The sun was setting, painting the sky in those same shades of orange and purple that seemed unique to Montana evenings. Mike breathed deeply, the clean air washing away the staleness of the city. Then he saw them. Ghost and her 3 cubs, all sitting at the edge of the clearing, waiting. They'd known he was back. Somehow, they'd known. Patch jumped to her feet and ran forward, stopping just short of Shadow. The 2 touched noses, and Mike could have sworn the wolf was grinning. The other 2 cubs followed, more cautiously, and Ghost remained seated, but her tail was moving slightly, that almost wag that Mike had come to recognize as her version of approval. Mike sat down on the ground, despite the cold seeping through his jeans. Shadow lay beside him, and they all watched the wolves together. This was his pack, his family. A retired cop who'd lost faith in the system, a police dog who'd given his best years to protecting others, and a wolf family that had every reason to fear humans but chose trust instead. It wasn't the life Mike had planned when he left Denver. It wasn't peaceful or simple or easy. But it was real. It was honest. It was worth fighting for. Ghost stood and took several steps toward Mike, closer than she'd ever come before. She stopped about 6 feet away and sat again. In her eyes, Mike saw acknowledgement. He'd gone back to his old territory and fought his battle, just as she'd fought hers against the rival pack. They'd both survived. They'd both protected what mattered. They were both home now. The connection between them, forged in that blizzard months ago, had been tested and proven stronger than either species' instincts to remain separate. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the stars began to appear overhead, Mike Cross felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the hollow emptiness of escape, but the solid contentment of purpose fulfilled. He'd saved a family in a storm, and in doing so, they'd saved him. From bitterness. From isolation. From the belief that honor and loyalty were extinct. The wolves had taught him that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about acting despite the fear. That justice wasn't about perfect systems. It was about imperfect people choosing to do what's right, and that sometimes the most profound connections transcend all logic, all boundaries, all the rules that say such things are impossible. As darkness fell over the Montana wilderness, Mike and Shadow sat with their unlikely pack, united not by species, but by something far more fundamental. The understanding that in a world that often felt cold and hostile, loyalty and courage still mattered. That one person, or one wolf, could make a difference. And that family wasn't always about blood. Sometimes it was about who showed up when the storm hit, who fought alongside you when you were outnumbered, who welcomed you home when you returned from battle. Mike looked at Ghost one last time before she led her cubs back into the forest. She held his gaze for a long moment, and in that silent exchange, everything was said. "Thank you. You're welcome. Stay safe. We'll be here." Then she was gone, and Mike and Shadow walked back to their cabin, both knowing that tomorrow, or next week, or whenever it mattered, they'd be ready to fight again. Together. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.